In responding to the unnamed critics of slavery, Aristotle doesn't reject their criticism outright, but attempts to sap its force by making a distinction between conventional slavery and natural slavery. Who or what is a natural slave? A man is a slave by nature, says Aristotle, who is, by nature, not his own but another's. The heart of the definition is that a natural slave is a human being belonging not to himself, but to another. Note the repetition of by nature. It occurs twice in the passage. The natural slave does not belong to himself by nature, and he belongs to another by nature. That's all very well, but how does one identify such human beings? Are there physiological or psychological markers that would allow us to pick out such natural slaves? Aristotle thinks that nature should bring it about that natural slaves are physiologically different in kind from free men. He writes, "Nature would like to distinguish between the bodies of free men and slaves, making the one strong for servile labour, the other upright and, although useless for such services, useful for political life and the arts, both of war and peace." However, as he ruefully notes, nature doesn't always oblige, so that the opposite often happens. If physiology provides us with no reliable guide to natural slaves, what of psychology? Human beings as human beings are necessarily rational, but the natural slave, says Aristotle, somewhat mysteriously, has just enough rationality. This mysterious claim is parsed out later and turns out to amount to the proposition that natural slaves are those unable to make decisions in respect of themselves and to need direction from others, such directions being for their own good. The natural slave, while rational in some sense, according to Aristotle, has no deliberative faculty at all. Although human and so presumptively rational, natural slaves function in a way that in essence is not very different from domestic animals. Aristotle has to hand a variety of models of authority and subordination: husband-wife, father-children, ruler-ruled. None of these is immediately appropriate to the master-slave relationship. Aristotle denies that the slave-master is a kind of tyrant, and the reason for this would appear to be that he envisages the relationship between master and slave to be mutually beneficial, whereas the relation of tyrant to tyrannized is not mutually beneficial. The abuse of authority on the part of the slave-master is injurious to both, for the interests of part and whole, of body and soul, are the same, and the slave is a part of the master, a living but separated part of his bodily frame. Hence, when the relation of master and slave between them is natural, they are friends and have a common interest, but where it rests merely on law and force, the reverse is true. This passage is passing strange. The symbiosis between slave-master and slave is again asserted, this time because the slave is, as it were, an exteriorized part of his master. Moreover, a relationship of friendship can subsist between a slave-master and a natural slave, whereas it can't between a slave-master and a merely legal slave. But if the natural slave is sub-rational, how can he be a friend with a rational being except in some attenuated sense? And while it might not be advisable for all sorts of reasons to be friends with your legal slaves, their being slaves is merely the result of misfortune, and they are not, or at least not necessarily, sub-rational, and so could in principle be friends with their masters. Where are these natural slaves to be found? Is it a happy coincidence that all, or at least most of the slaves in Athens are natural slaves? We may glean a hint of a possible answer to this question from the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle refers to people who live by their senses alone, like some races of distant barbarians, and so presumably possess just the right amount of rationality, enough to make them human, but not enough to make them capable of directing their own affairs. Aristotle defends the method of acquiring slaves by capture and war, but only if the war is just. However, he seems to think that all wars with barbarians, from which source his natural slaves will come, are in any case just. There's an air of intellectual desperation about Aristotle's theory of the natural slave. Only too aware of the arbitrary and possibly unjust nature of slaves taken in war, yet unable to conceive of the polis's functioning without the aid of slaves, Aristotle is driven to perpetrate an incoherent account of a kind of slavery that is in accord with nature and so does not violate natural justice. Peter Garnsey concludes that natural slavery, as presented by Aristotle, is a battered shipwreck of a theory, and Fisher says of Aristotle's account that it is flawed by fundamental contradictions and illogicalities, as well as by the standard Greek-centred contempt for foreigners and insensitivity to slaves. While giving Aristotle every credit for facing up to the theoretical problem of slavery, as no one before him had, it is hard to disagree with these negative assessments. We have very little first-hand material from the Stoics on the topic of slavery. This is particularly the case with the early Stoics and the Stoics of the Middle School, Panaetius and Posidonius. Garnsey remarks, "There is a penury of collections of snippets culled from the works of substantially later writers, often unsympathetic and tendentious. And even though we have somewhat more material from late Stoics, such as Seneca and Epictetus, there is no guarantee that what they have to say mirrors what was said by early members of the school. One might conclude from the paucity of material that while there may have been substantial material available at one time, the exigencies of history have dispersed or destroyed it. The other possibility is that there never was much material, the Stoics not having much interest in legal slavery as distinct from their concentration on slavery of the soul." This Stoic attitude is not peculiar to the phenomenon of slavery, but is in fact their regular approach to external circumstances in general. They tended to regard such things as accidents of fortune. Fortune is not in our control. Our response to fortune is. Garnsey writes, "To the Stoic, legal slavery is of no significance. It is not in our control. It is one of the externals like health and illness, wealth and poverty, high and low status. As such, it is to be judged as neither good nor bad, but rather indifferent." Did the Stoics reject the theory of natural slavery? It is sometimes assumed that they did, but if they did, it's not obvious. It is certainly true that it is difficult to see how one might hold certain Stoic doctrines, such as the common kinship of all peoples, and not reject the idea of natural slavery, but thinkers are not always consistent and don't always draw out fully the consequences of their beliefs. In the works of some Stoics, such as Posidonius, we encounter a vision of an apolitical golden age in which those less wise voluntarily submitted to the rule of their superiors in wisdom, and those superiors did not exploit their inferiors. Seneca writes, "The first men on this earth, and their immediate descendants, followed nature unspoiled. They took a single person as their leader and their law, freely submitting to the decision of an individual of superior mind. In that age, which people commonly refer to as the Golden Age, government, so Posidonius maintains, was in the hands of the wise." We can find an echo of this view in St. Thomas's idea that political society would have existed even if our first parents in Eden had not sinned. But such voluntary subordination, whatever else it may be, isn't slavery. In the Jewish scriptures or Old Testament, the term slavery can cover a number of different statuses. There was debt slavery of fellow Jews. This was by and large a temporary affair. It could arise by means of self-sale or by the sale of a member of one's family. Debt slaves were supposed to be released after 6 years, although this didn't always happen. Philo, early in the 1st century AD, in his De Specialibus Legibus, notes that Jewish slaves are to serve only for 6 years, unless they voluntarily choose to remain in service, for example, to remain with their wife and children. On the other hand, the enslavement of prisoners of war was permanent, unless they were redeemed by ransom. Slaves, male and female, might be purchased from the surrounding nations or from sojourners. These are property and may be bequeathed like any other property and, unlike Jewish slaves, can be held forever, not merely for 6 years. Enslaving foreigners who had been kidnapped was forbidden, as was allowing the extradition of fugitive slaves. The essential humanity of the slave was recognized in that the unlawful killing of a slave was regarded as murder. The lex talionis is also an indication of fundamental equality, in that, in contrast to surrounding nations where a slave who had injured his master could be executed, in Hebrew law he could be punished only to the extent that he had himself transgressed the law, but no more. Isaac writes, "We do not know how extensively the legal provisions, including the emancipation laws and the Jubilee year freedom and capital punishment for killing a slave, were enforced or practiced. Nonetheless, there is no denying that the Hebrew biblical laws had a theoretically distinctive ethical thrust, different from the ancient Near Eastern laws and other precedents." Despite the fact that the Hebrews had themselves been slaves in Egypt and were constantly reminded of this in their scriptures, the idea of a complete abolition of slavery is not to be found in the Hebrew Bible. On the other hand, there is no suggestion there, as there is in Aristotle, that any human being is a slave by nature. In the end, the tensions that can be found in the Hebrew Bible regarding slavery reflect the Hebrews' own history, their economic and political circumstances, and their accommodation to the institution of slavery as a small nation to the customs of their times. In his treatise, Every Good Man is Free, the 1st century AD Jewish philosopher Philo distinguishes two kinds of freedom. One is the kind that keeps one's body free from the domination of other men, that's legal slavery. The other keeps one's soul free from the domination of vices and passions, that's moral slavery. In a stoicizing vein, Philo argues that legal slaves are not real slaves, their domination simply being the result of misfortune. Moral slavery, on the other hand, is within our control, and those who are moral slaves cannot blame their condition on misfortune. Philo also believed that moral slavery was ordained by God, who has created two natures, one servile, the other blessed. He went on to sanction the subjection of moral slaves to institutional slavery because they need to be controlled in their own and in everyone else's interest. Commenting on the Essenes, Philo observes that they had no slaves and that they denounced slave owners not merely for their injustice in outraging the law of equality, but also for their impiety in annulling the statute of nature which makes men brothers. Similarly, he notes that the Therapeutai consider that the ownership of men is against nature, nature having made all men free. Does this mean that Philo is committed to the abolition of slavery? Well, not necessarily. The Essenes and the Therapeutai differ from mainstream communities in almost every respect, in regards to money, property, and slavery. There is no implication, writes Garzi, that ordinary communities can get by without slaves. Philo is quite clear that they could not. Given what we find in the New Testament and the writings of the Fathers of the Church, it is very difficult to sustain the argument that Christianity made any significant difference to the position of slaves in their societies. The contribution of early Christianity to the issue of slavery amounted to not very much more than an admonition to slave masters to treat their slaves well, together with unremitting advice to slaves to obey their masters willingly. Ernst Troeltsch claimed that, quote, "the Christians changed nothing whatever in the laws affecting slaves, allowing slavery to endure right on into the Middle Ages. Yet the Church was fully conscious of the inconsistency between this institution and the inner freedom and equality which was the Christian ideal. The early Church simply accepted the political and social status quo, and in doing so took slavery for granted. Even when we had Christian emperors, their legislation at best ameliorated the position of slaves. Abolition of the institution was not on the agenda." Macmullen writes, "If we ask whether life was on the whole easier for slaves in Christian times than in pagan, the answer is probably no. The new religion introduced no radical innovation, only development along lines laid down earlier. The Church itself, corporately, and its priests individually, and its models and heroes, as well as at least the richer members of congregations whom church leaders normally address, continue to own, buy, and sell men, women, and children. The distinction between slavery of the body and slavery of the soul did receive an added impetus with the arrival of Christianity. With the development of Stoicism, Christianity allowed the concept of slavery to be developed in such a way that a distinction came to be drawn between legal slavery, the physically coercive control of one man by another, and moral slavery, the subjugation of one's better self to one's baser self. Using this distinction, it is possible for a slave to be morally free and a free man to be morally a slave. Seneca, in his De Beneficiis, denies that slavery penetrates to a man's moral interior. He writes, "Only the body is at the mercy and disposition of a master. The mind, however, is its own master." Together with every other writer and thinker of his period, St. Paul accepts the institution of slavery. As is clear from his letters to the Corinthians, he exhorts his readers to be content to remain in their social condition, writing, "Everyone should remain in the state in which he was called. Were you a slave when called? Never mind. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity." In Colossians and in other epistles, he tells slaves to obey in everything those that are your earthly masters. In Ephesians, Paul seems to express complete acceptance of the status quo regarding slavery, admonishing slaves to be obedient to their earthly masters, not reluctantly, but willingly, and from the heart. Masters are counseled to forbear threatening their slaves. There's no hint at all in this passage, or any others, that there might be anything fundamentally problematic with slavery. And unlike the 6-year restriction that we find in the Jewish law, Paul mentions no such restriction. The reason for this acceptance of the status quo is simply that, provided your relationship to Christ is in order, your social status, as with all worldly matters, is ultimately a matter of no importance. It seems then that in the context of the fundamental spiritual equality of all human beings, all existing human distinctions, male, female, Jew, Greek, slave-free, were relatively insignificant. There are a number of passages in which Paul erases all social distinctions, the most famous of which is in Galatians, where he writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Christ is not only the one who flattens out and erases all human distinctions, he is also the one who, through his own voluntary act of abasement, which ended in a slave's death, shows us that our salvation lies in our becoming slaves of righteousness. Paul again. Christ Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Augustine, in his commentary on the Psalms, echoes and indeed amplifies Paul's acceptance of slavery. He remarks that Christ did not make free men out of slaves, but good slaves out of bad slaves, and points out that the rich should be grateful to Christ for creating stability in their homes. Commenting on Psalm 124, he relies on Paul's injunction that slaves should obey their masters to justify his claim that the just should give honor to those who rule over them, even if those rulers are unjust. As should be obvious from this, Augustine, as with most of the thinkers of his period, accepted the social fact of slavery, which, along with other forms of property, is justified by the positive law of the ruler. What makes my house to be my house, and my slave to be my slave, is man-made law. Augustine writes, "Take away the laws of emperors, and who will dare say, that villa is mine, and that slave is mine, or this house is mine?" People have accepted the laws of kings so that they can possess those very things. As is the case with Paul, slaves are exhorted to obey their masters, and masters to maintain the order of the household. In the order of creation, no man was intended to be a slave either to any other man or to lust. God did not desire man to dominate over other men, but only over irrational creatures. Augustine writes that God did not wish the rational being, made in his own image, to have dominion over any but irrational creatures, nor man over man, but man over beasts. It follows, he thinks, that kingship was not an original item of society. Slavery, then, is not natural, but the result of sin, whether one's own sins or the sins of others. Augustine is sensitive to the claim that the arbitrary imposition of slavery on men by a just God is difficult to defend. His solution is to present slavery as a punishment for sin. He writes in The City of God, "The prime cause of slavery then is sin, so that man was put under man in a state of bondage." This being so, he's content to endorse the theory that slavery is for the benefit of the enslaved. In Book 3 of Cicero's Republic, Philus argues that the state cannot exist or be properly administered without injustice. It is unjust for some men to be made to serve others, yet no imperial city can exist or function unless this is done. Laelius responds in a quasi-Aristotelian mode that slavery can be beneficial for some. Augustine, commenting on this, echoes Laelius, claiming that those who are made to serve are in fact benefited by this compulsion. He writes, "Servitude is in the interest of such men. Those subdued will be better off because when not subdued, they were worse off." If we leave aside the question-begging sub-argument in the last part of the quotation, we can see that the counter to the argument is simply the reassertion that those coerced into service are in fact benefited by that coercion. Augustine isn't the only church father to make this point. Ambrose, commenting on the story of Esau's enslavement to Jacob, says, "Isaac was right to deny Esau freedom to make his own choices, else he might drift like a ship in the waves without a helmsman." Basil of Caesarea initially seems to come down firmly on the side of the rejection of slavery as unnatural. Slavery occurs only because of misfortune in war or self-sale in cases of economic distress. But when he considers the Jacob-Esau story, he makes the point that some are by nature slaves to others because they lack the ability to self-direct. On the other hand, Lactantius in the 4th century AD, writing in his Divine Institutes, states boldly that all men are free by virtue of their divine creation, and he accuses the Greeks and the Romans of injustice because of their institution of social divisions between man and man. Eventually, however, Lactantius falls back upon the distinction between legal slavery and moral slavery, downplaying the significance of the legal form. Garnsey remarks, however, that the damage has been done. What stays in the mind is the absence of justice among men. Despite Lactantius's efforts to repair the damage he has himself inflicted, the logic of his own argument is that spiritual equality is a second best. If Lactantius lets half the cat out of the bag, Gregory of Nyssa lets the feline fly free. In one of his homilies, he remarks scathingly that God would not therefore reduce the human race to slavery, since he himself, when we had been enslaved to sin, spontaneously recalled us to freedom. But if God does not enslave what is free, who is he that sets his own power above God's? Man is made in the image and likeness of God, and all are alike in their bodily frames, their desires, their troubles, and their anguish, and their joys. He then asks, if you are equal in all these ways, therefore, in what respect have you something extra, tell me, that you who are human think yourself the master of a human being? This looks very much like an attack on slavery as something so fundamentally opposed to God's design for man that it would seem to merit outright rejection. On the other hand, Theodoret roundly condemns what he regards as a class of professional complainers, those who resent taxes and bewail slavery and many other things that, as he says, fit only too well into this life. Who were these 5th century AD troublemakers that merit Theodoret's condemnation? The general consensus is that they were Eustachian, that is, Manichaean heretics. Theodoret was not alone in his opposition to the social radicals. The Council of Gangra decreed that if anyone on the pretext of religion teaches another man's slave to despise his master and to withdraw from his service and not to serve his master with goodwill and all respect, let him be anathema. This decree was incorporated into the Church's collection of canons and was used for the next 1400 years. Defenders of New World slavery were not slow to pick up on these sentiments. Thomas Dew, while conceding that slavery is against the spirit of Christianity, notes that there is nothing in either the Old or the New Testament that requires slavery to be abrogated. The Hebrews approved of slavery, and there is nothing in the New Testament to disturb the conscience of a slaveholder. Christ himself did not counsel insurrection, even though he lived in the midst of a Roman world. The apostolic writings of Paul and other New Testament writers show clearly, he thinks, that slavery in the Roman world was nowhere charged as a fault or a crime upon the holder, and everywhere is the most implicit obedience enjoined.